For today's episode, we will be discussing Herman Webster Mudgett, aka H. Holmes. He was America's first serial killer, confessing to 27 murders, and he was hung in 1896. Though he already confessed to how many people he killed, some estimate Holmes had killed up to 200 people in his murder castle. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary, let's start off with his childhood. As often the serial killer cases for this episode series, the childhood of Holmes was shaped by physical abuse, difficulties in socializing with peers, and cruelty towards animals. Holmes' childhood behaviors did reflect his problems. He was bullied as a child, and he had become obsessed with death. He was even suspected of murdering a childhood friend. Holmes' mother was said to have a terminal illness that traumatized the family. Many serial killers encounter psychological trauma early on in their life that create mental disorders leading to their twisted thoughts and actions. But he wasn't initially diagnosed with such mental disorders because it was so far back then. Holmes enrolled into the University of Vermont in Burlington at the age of 18, but he was dissatisfied with the school and left after 1 year. In 1882, he entered the University of Michigan Hospital. He then graduated in June 1884 after passing his exams. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor William James Herdman. The two were said to have been engaging in facilitating grave robbings to supply medical cadavers. I'm sure that gave him more ideas on how to move the bodies for his later crimes. As far as his childhood, that's all there was to find. But let's move on to his adult life. Now, when I say adult life, I do mean his marriage, kids, his jobs, where he worked, and where he moved. So, at the age of 16, he had odd jobs for various people. And it was then he met Clara Lovering, the daughter of his employer. The two formed a relationship and eloped when they were both 17 years old. Their union was kept secret, and they lived apart for a while, before eventually revealing that they were married. And soon after, Clara gave birth to their first child. Holmes pursued a medical career and settled in different places, while the mother and the son lived in Clara's parents' house. By 1886, which is the same time that he moved to Chicago, Holmes was living a life as a single man. Despite still being married to Clara, he courted and married Myrta Belknap. It was after the marriage that Holmes decided to file for divorce from his first wife. He prepared the papers and sent them to Clara, but she never received them. As a result, the divorce was never finalized, according to the historical collection. Marta gave birth to his daughter in 1889, as Holmes established a successful business in Chicago. Can I put finger quotation marks on successful, just foreshadowing his crimes. Now, just to explain, as I was doing my research, I couldn't find any information on if he was entangled with Marta, if Marta was also helping him. I know he had a business partner, but we do not know what was going on between him and Marta. But he got married yet again in 1894, this time to Georgiana Yoke. Aside from having 3 other wives, Holmes was reported to have several mistresses, some of whom became his murder victims. Now, during this quote-unquote successful business, Mudgett required his employees to carry life insurance policies naming him as a beneficiary, so that he could collect money after he killed them. He sold the bodies of many of his victims to local medical schools. Now let me just clarify, I do not know when they met, but Holmes became intimate friends with Benjamin Petizel, a carpenter with a criminal past. He employed Petizel as his right-hand man for his vicious criminal plans. I just had to slide that information in there because it's going to be very important later in the case. So, after a few years of collecting money as a beneficiary from his victims, he built a hotel of horrors to lure and kill guests during the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893. The hotel was called the Murder Castle. So technically, in a way, he was a genius that Chicago never saw coming. As well as a genius, he was a player. To discuss his crimes and keep it short, H. Holmes was a con artist, a businessman, and an organized killer, with a diabolical palate for experimentation on human bodies. He chose a career of crime including insurance fraud, swindling, check forging, 3 to 4 ambiguous illegal marriages, murder, and horse theft. It is said, too, that he did begin killing people in order to steal property. He had killed people in Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, as well as Canada. Now, this all happened between the dates of 1886 to 1894, totaling in 27-plus victims, all men, women, and children. Holmes was finally caught after attempting to use a female corpse in an insurance scam on November 17, 1894. Chicago police investigated Holmes' castle, where they discovered his strange and efficient methods for committing torturous murders. Many of the bodies they located were so badly dismembered and decomposed that it was hard for them to determine exactly how many bodies there really were. Now, he was caught then, but later arrested for the murder of Pitzel, his business partner. This scheme, which was to take place in Philadelphia, called for Pitzel to set himself up as an inventor under the name of B.F. Perry, and then be killed and disfigured in a lab explosion. Holmes was to find an appropriate cadaver to play the role of Pitzel. Instead, Holmes killed Pitzel by knocking him unconscious with chloroform and setting his body on fire with the use of benzene. In his confession, Holmes implied Pitzel was still alive after he used the chloroform on him before setting him on fire. However, forensic evidence presented at Holmes' later trial showed chloroform had been administered after Pitzel's death, presumably to fake suicide to exonerate Holmes should he be charged with murder. Holmes was paid $7,500 by Hertz Papers in exchange for this confession. Holmes was put on trial for the murder of Pitzel, confession of 27 murders, and 6 attempted murders. He was sentenced to death by hanging. On May 7, 1896, Henry Howard Holmes, a.k.a. Herman Webster Mudgett, was executed by hanging for all of his crimes and murders.